This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. As you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you have an interest in an FDA-regulated company or its products, this is the podcast for you. So today's podcast guest is one you've actually seen recently, and we had a really great time. We did also have some glitches, so he was kind enough to come back on. We're going to be talking about privacy. We're going to be talking about digital advertising. We're going to be talking about cookies, and not the kinds that are tasty, but the kinds that are really, some might argue, are unpalatable. So if you are in marketing, if you are in sales, if you are in developing a technology around engaging with patients or engaging with caregivers, this is the podcast for you. Our guest today is the Senior Counsel at the Network Advertising Initiative. He supports NAI's annual compliance reviews of member companies, along with the VP of Compliance and Membership Development, and leads the management and onboarding of new members. So our guest for today, Matthew Nichols. Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Darshan. Good to hear from you again. And, I guess I should just tell you, the questions were just getting too hard last time. So I was just feigning. I guess it's getting too hot, so I got to find a way to get out. But
it's sort of like, when you hear, when you're talking to someone on the cell phone, they go, yeah, I'm passing through something. I can't hear you right now.
And it's so easy to do. Like, nobody understands how the internet works. So it's just like, I don't know. It's starting to glitch out. I can't get it to work. Sorry. Gotta go.
Perfect. So thank you for coming on, though. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the world. One of the things that has really popped up for me quite recently has been the idea of a federal privacy law. And we've been talking about that for years. We've had HIPAA before, but nothing really significant outside maybe the FTC Act and HIPAA are really your big ones that people tend to think about. You and I had a very brief conversation outside, and your comment was, dude, I don't even keep track of some of these things because they don't have general broad support, and they often tend to die before they get anywhere serious. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about what is your position? Okay, just to be clear, when I say your position, you don't represent NAI right now, and this is your personal opinion. So what is your take is a more appropriate question than what is your position. But what is your take on the development of a federal privacy law? Is it something that is going to happen? Is it something that needs to happen?
Yeah, and thankfully my opinions are aligned with my organization, so that does make it helpful. I guess in terms of will it happen and should it happen, will it happen? I don't know. Should it happen? Yes. But I guess I think what makes it more interesting is unpacking why it's so difficult to get a consumer privacy law here in the US, as opposed to what we're seeing in obviously Europe, Brazil, Thailand has one recently, and then obviously we have a bunch of state laws. It really kind of gets back to, to our country being more comfortable around the consumer use of data, in that data being used in the consumer construct or aspect raises less risks associated with what harm can come from it, right? Whether or not you agree with that may be different, but if you look at some of our other privacy laws here in the US, we have, again, right, GLBA, which is finance, right? HIPAA, health insurance, or it's the medical field. You have COPPA, children, right? So we have this sectoral approach to privacy law here in the US, and it's worked pretty well in a lot of ways. We have very specific, narrowly or tailored laws to address those different industries. But when it comes to the consumer aspect, it's difficult because we've gotten a lot of great things around the uses of consumer data. That doesn't mean that it's all been good and that there hasn't been bad actors. It's just that there's a lot more balancing that has to go on, and it's not easy to have conversations around this stuff because it's not easy to point to directly what is my harm around data that's associated with my browser or my device and how I acted on that browser device to then be used for advertising. And I say advertising because that's the area I work in, and that's where I hear most about these topics here. Sorry, little computer glitch. Questions are getting too hard. I'm about to get ready to... But there's a lot more benefits that the internet has provided. And again, right, advertising being where I focus on, it's where I think about a lot of this stuff. And I enjoy the free content I get, right? I enjoy some of the ad-supported things I'm able to get access to. And the data that gets used for that, again, right, is not associated generally with me individually. It's generally associated with my browser device, which can be deleted, which can be reset. But that was an argument that held water for many years because of how the technology was evolved. But now it has grown. And now this data does seem to be very specifically tied to me as an individual in a lot of ways. And so as the technology has evolved in this space, I think the growing concern over this isn't just kind of innocuous data. This actually is some really interesting insights that you can get about a user. Yeah, maybe the harm is still kind of tough to pinpoint, but look, consumers need to be made aware and given a real valid choice in all this. So where you kind of draw that line is still difficult to do, and which is why I think it's been tough to kind of do a federal privacy law in this space. And so the states, like as our legal system is meant to do, is the states are kind of the experiment lab for figuring out what privacy law should look like here in the US for consumers. And there's been some really good stuff that has been put in place. I think certainly around areas around governance and doing certain things like ensuring that there's an assessment that's being done to ensure that data is being used appropriately within an organization. Those kinds of things are really good. When you're putting restrictions around a way in which a publisher has the ability to use the data of the customers that they interact with and what must be allowed to gain access to this content and what choice consumers have, that's where it gets to be difficult. And if you don't really sit with this stuff every day, it's hard to be able to have that conversation and draft that kind of stuff in legislation. So whether or not we get it, it feels like our country's got a lot bigger issues to deal with at the moment. And so privacy tends to be something that gets touched upon later in any kind of administration. But who knows? We'll see. I think it's necessary. I think we need it. I think what the states are up to is, as the argument always goes, it's causing a lot of friction on companies being able to comply with all these disparate requirements. And I think companies do need to have an omnibus or a singular set of requirements that they need to play towards. But it's a long road to get there, I think.
So it raises a few different things for me, right? So one question you asked that I'd maybe get into is this idea of what is the harm. And I think from the healthcare industry perspective, I can think of one really major place that there's harm, which is the U.S. Data Shield Law, which with GDPR, we obviously would have been covered saying that, we have a federal standard that we think represents how we protect data. But the European Union has basically come out and said, you don't even have a federal standard. Between that and the fact that you guys have major issues with government hacking, we're just not fans of giving you guys access to our people's data. So if we had a federal standard, that's something we might be able to point to. But without that, every individual company has to basically do this whole analysis and sort of demonstrate that they protect individual interests for people within the EU and subject to GDPR, if you will. But so I think that's one thought process, if you will, on what is the harm, because you can actually point to monetary implications associated with it. But the second question that sort of came to mind was, well, I'll let you respond to that before I go to the second question. So do you have any thoughts there, or do you see that as sort of it's a little outside what I consider part of harm, if you will?
I mean, the question of harm, again, is a tricky one. I think even when it comes to, like, you look at our set of standards under the NEI's Code of Conduct, we have very limited restrictions on like outright prohibitions around certain uses of data. I think you can point to some pretty clear examples of data collected in this context should not be allowed to determine my creditworthiness, right? Like that's a very clear example that we think where that the misuse of that data, whether it's inaccurate data or was gained in a certain way that I wasn't aware that was going to be used for that purpose. Like if it could determine whether or not I get offered a loan, that's going to result in concrete harm to my personal life. Same with background checks for unemployment or my ability to get into admissions of eligibility, right? Those are specific things that we can point to. But when it comes to like, and this is where it gets to be difficult, is just when this information, and I'm talking all this on the assumption of good actors that are intending to use this data for limited purposes around advertising, right? Like the harm that stems from that, it gets to be far more nebulous and difficult to kind of pinpoint. Now, I think that's a different conversation on, I think it's one thing to say that the harm that stems from data that's collected for a specific use case around advertising or marketing is hard to define, but that doesn't mean consumers aren't deserving of very clear notice and choice around, or the ability to make a choice about that, right? And that is where I think the industry is realizing or recognizing that this is where we really need to correct our course criteria, if you will, around making sure that consumers are clearly informed and upfront, aware of why it is that their data may be collected and used, and what choice that they have a part of that. But yeah.
So that really raises the second question you pointed out, which was an important question that gets ignored, which is when you give up that data, companies don't charge you. And the ad-supported model, which is what the entire internet for the most part is based on. And it's come back in many ways to bite newspapers in the butt, but because they never quite pivoted in the way they may have appropriately done so argumentatively, if you will. Though having said that, I'm not sure BuzzFeed is that great a option, but let's ignore that for a second. But if you are ad-supported, you might be able to, you don't have to pay for it, and that's a genuine value to the consumer. I guess my question that comes out of that is, in previous versions of ad-supported, I'm thinking more of the broadcasting industry, they never knew what I as an individual do. So user-level data, if you will. But they knew that people who watch this type of program tends to be between the ages of blah and blah. They probably have XYZ type of income. I guess that's what Nielsen ratings went into, I'm guessing. I've never seen what a Nielsen rating looks like. But they get that information. Is there a reason we couldn't go back to that type of targeting, where it's market level, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, we might be going back to that. I mean, there's certainly a lot of work being done to still allow the current use cases of data to still occur that allows that user level ability to find a particular user for targeting of an ad. But there's a lot being done to kind of bring us back to that more, as you say, market level or higher level, or what we're seeing like group-based targeting where you can't identify a particular individual. And whether or not that works, nobody actually, like everybody kind of makes the argument like, well, with cookies turned off, you lose 50% of revenue, or with this group-based targeting, we can still achieve 95% of what cookies were allowed for previously. We don't really know for sure, but I guess in my mind, when I think about this stuff and I think about the trade-offs that are allowed and what results in the inability for advertisers to target their audiences or their potential audiences wherever they are around the internet, it does force me to think about the really niche websites that I may go to that don't have a large footprint that major advertisers would want to advertise for. And so that does worry me that if everything turns into contextual based, that the websites that I go to where I can read really kind of fun reviews on movie blog or movies that I enjoy watching, that they won't be able to at least fulfill or fund the content that they're putting up. And so does the internet kind of contract as a result of no longer, because like when I go to these websites, I can still get shoe advertisements for a particular shoe company that I enjoy, right? And that's because they're able to find me and they're able to fund their, like, I don't know that I would have clicked on any advertisement on a movie blog website on movie specific things or like, so it's what it ends up doing to the internet is could potentially have this kind of contraction. And I don't think that's what we want, where we limit the internet and who can play in it to larger companies or larger publishers. And I don't think that's what we want, or we don't want everything moved behind paywalls either, because that is really going to create this kind of dichotomy of who has access to content online. So I think that's scared, like the potential of that reality of where the internet no longer, obviously there's bad parts to the internet, but the good parts that we all enjoy, the risk of that going away, the diversity of content going away based off moves where we're kind of headed towards, or large parts of groups would like to head towards, that harm scares me more right now, and I think is a more concrete potential harm than I think some of the harms that get kind of bandied about in terms of ad-supported content based off of my activity online. Now, again, that doesn't mean that I don't think that there needs to be additional controls and education around this stuff so users are fully aware of how they are engaging in this and able to make a choice with whether or not they want to participate. But so there's several things there.
No, it's a great point, but I think your comment is based on an assumption that I'm not 100% sure I agree with you on, or at least my experience doesn't match up. In that, what your argument is based on is this idea that there are niches on the internet, which I'm 100% agreeing with you on, and they're monetized, which I'm 100% agreeing with you on. What I think we may differ on is who is monetizing them. So it's Google or Apple or whoever is a other manufacturer or company monetizing it, as opposed to the small company creating the niche content. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I'll talk about myself. I tend to do these interviews, which I thoroughly enjoy. I get to talk to interesting people like yourself, but I've never seen a dime out of it. And I don't know if I'm going to see a dime out of it. It's because it's not, my website isn't set up to be monetizable. I do it because I truly, genuinely enjoy the conversation. So my point is, if you're in a niche, you often end up doing it because you enjoy it, not necessarily because you end up being the beneficiary of the money. So I guess my point I'm making is, are cookies and the like benefiting someone, but not the people you argued they're benefiting, i.e. they're benefiting larger companies?
I think I see your point. And is your point that there is concern that the money that gets generated based off of the ad-supported internet doesn't seem to be flowing to the content creators that...
Correct.
Yeah, I think that from what... Certainly I don't sit on the publisher side as much, but I'm very much aware of that concern and that argument. And in terms of issues around limited publisher control over terms and the ability to actually see the revenue or how accurate it actually was and ad fraud. And of course, that is a legitimate concern on the part of content creators and publishers online. And it is definitely a part of, I think, some of the problems, I don't want to say problems, but the obstacles we're facing as an industry trying to kind of recognize where things are headed with the loss of third parties as an identifier, and the need for recognizing that, well, if we're going to move into this new space where IDs are associated with some version of a hashed email address, and how do we actually get that data to create an identifier based off of information that I'm providing to the website that I go to? There's a whole new dynamic at play that needs to occur in terms of publishers, first parties kind of acting like the data gatekeepers to allow third-party ad tech and advertisers to monetize that or create and fund campaigns for that. Like that's a huge lift that you're asking on part of publishers who already feel as though they've been the short person on the stick of the ad-supported internet. So now we want to go further and just say, oh yeah, and publishers, we're going to need you to start getting email addresses for us as well.
Right.
Don't worry about it. We're going to make this all work. Like, I think publishers are my sense, and from what I've heard, publishers are very much like, whoa. All right, now you want to do this as well? Like, no, we need to have a different conversation here a little bit. We need to figure out how we can, I guess, level the playing field a little bit here to make sure that the issues that are particular to publishers, like the ability to turn off advertising on their website at certain times, or to make sure that I don't see these kinds of ads around different ads on my site, or that I don't see an ad for one thing when I'm posting about content on another topic, like just to have that control. Because my understanding is publishers don't generally have that level of control. And so if we're going to start moving to a form of technology for this space that requires more direct implementation support from publishers, we need to involve them in these conversations more than we have historically as an industry. What I think is difficult right now is that everybody's just trying to scramble to figure out where are we going to move to before 2022 and Google Chrome turns off cookies, third-party cookies, that enough focus hasn't been spent on that perspective on the conversation. But if we're going to kind of come together as an industry to get this right, we got to figure that part out, because our publisher friends are very much important and integral to this conversation for the reasons we mentioned.
Right, which really raises that next role and next question, which is, if you are a publisher in that space, how do you how do you get consent? And what I mean by that is this idea of right now when I go to a UK website, I'll get the pop-up saying, here are the things we want to use your data for, and feel free to opt out of it. And it's a click away, and then I see the options, and it's like 19 options they want me to use. And the one that says, I don't want you using my data at all to the extent you can. So the necessary cookies need to be there, but everything else doesn't. And it's hidden in the middle of everything. I guess my question is, do you think that GDPR as it exists, or a potential federal privacy law, needs to do a better job in enabling opt-outs, which has not sort of happened so far, at least? Does that question make sense?
It might. It could just be my own limited capability or capacity here. I think if your question is kind of derived around making it easier for consumers, like putting the appropriate protections in place for consumers in this dynamic of how they engage with their content online without ruining the experience or making it exceedingly difficult for consumers to express their choice or to be made aware of how they are going to be a part of this engagement or this dynamic. Yeah, I think work always needs to be done on that front, right? Like, it is, again, a very difficult balance. I think you've seen this in the GDPR, you've seen this in the work that's been done with what I assume you're referring to as different consent management platforms. So that, a typical website, you go in Europe, you now see a kind of consent screen that says, hey, this website wants to be able to collect data associated with your activity, and here are all the different ways in which this data is going to be used, and here is your kind of menu of choices that you're allowed to make for that, right? Like, that was the industry very much trying its hardest to accommodate what it was being told that it needed to show in a consent screen, right? Like, being able to say that everything's like, there was a lot of pushback saying like, look, you can't lump all different types of data use cases under a single opt-in screen or a single checkbox, right? You need to allow users to say yes or no to different kinds of data use cases. And you also need to do it in a way that explains it very well, but you also need to make sure that you're not making it exceedingly difficult. So it's like trying to get that just right is not a science by any stretch. It's definitely more of an art, right? And so I think as we continue to have that conversation here in the US, we're gonna have to definitely take lessons from what we're seeing in Europe to apply that to any kind of federal privacy law. I think if we were to get a federal privacy law that mirrors that kind of requirement or that kind of need for notice and choice, I think it'll be some kind of scaled back version of it. I would have a hard time believing that the level of specificity that seems to be necessary in Europe will be similarly required here. But in terms of making sure consumers then have the ability to pull themselves out of that world and being able to say that I no longer choose to participate or allow my data to be used. Yeah, I mean, I myself, as well as our organization, we fully support that consumers need to have this choice be made available to them as easy as possible. And how you get that exactly, whether it's a opt-out button that's always existing, whether it's on your browser through some plugin or a link that's always made available on any participating website, that, I mean, we already kind of have that to a certain extent already through the ad choice icon program, where on any ad that you see on the internet today, it's going to be accompanied by the ad choices icon, which then can bring you to a website where you can provide an opt-out for all companies that participate in this self-reg program. Like, we already have it to a certain extent. How well it's working and how well consumers are aware of it is a different question. But I think we get there more closely when we move to a model where if there's going to be direct user level type ad targeting that takes place, that there needs to be that more direct upfront notice of, hey, this is what you're participating in. Like, I think the issues around opt-out and users' ability to find it gets eased a little bit if we stop having this kind of passive relationship with consumers that says that, yeah, if you go find our privacy policy, go check it out. There's an opt-out link made available in the privacy policy if you look through it, right? Like, if we're being more upfront and being very clear with users that this is what you're going to be participating in and here's how you can opt out, the concerns around users' ability to find that and to make that choice, I think gets lessened so long as, we're not intentionally trying to vary it.
So we can keep going, obviously, and I already have a whole slew of topics I want to get into, but I'd love to have you come back and talk to us a little bit more about cookies and where it could be going and what do the recent decisions seem to imply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Would you be open to coming back?
Always, Darshan. And then, another full session as well.
Another full session, that's great. I'm going to ask you 2 questions from our quickfire round, or 3 questions from our quickfire round, just to end the day, because people seem to like these questions. Are you ready?
Ready as I'll ever be.
Okay, so here's my favorite one. If you were going to build a 2020 Mount Rushmore, who would be the first person on it and why?
Is there room for someone like myself? Would I look good on a Mount Rushmore?
I think you look great on Mount Rushmore. I think we may need to call it Mount Nichols at that point.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I'm from the Dakotas originally, so that works, right? And I don't know, if I were to try to kind of sincerely answer that question, that's a tough one. I don't know if I can do it. A singular person that is of that kind of deification in our country. I'm very hesitant of that, right? That's why I think the best option is just to put me.
The consensus candidate. I love it. When you can't make a choice, vote for me.
That makes sense to me.
Using that same theme, what is the best compliment you've ever received outside "you should be on Mount Rushmore"?
Generally, the better compliments I feel like I've gotten is when someone has told me that I have asked a question that they don't normally get, or that I bring a perspective to a topic that doesn't normally get addressed. I think that I always find like, oh, good. That means I'm bringing something unique to this debate or this topic or this issue. And then that's something I always strive to do. That doesn't mean I succeed in it. But when I'm able to do that, that always feels, and gets commented on, that always feels good.
See, you're a smarter person than I am, because when I get that question, it's usually preceded with, there's no stupid question. You've asked a unique question that no one else has asked before.
There's this old South Park bit where Mr. Garrison goes, "No, there is no stupid question, just stupid people." One of the greatest lines of a cartoon.
That's great. Last question. What is your favorite way to give back to your community?
My favorite, or the way that I actually do? I would say the way that I probably give back to my community the most is probably through different environmental efforts.
Oh, interesting.
And I find that the easiest way I'm able to do that is to donate what I'm able to donate to, in different environmental groups. And that's probably the thing that's my most altruistic thing that I do. On top of compost and recycling is more environmental. So that's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as a guest, based on our discussion, what is one question you'd like the audience to answer for us in the comments?
Say that again one more time.
If you had to ask the audience a question, what would you ask them based on what we've discussed?
If I were to ask the audience a question, you didn't prepare me for that one. I don't know. I mean, I guess I would be like, because sometimes what I worry about is that I feel like I've been doing this work on this side of the aisle, if you will, for the last 4 or 5 years. And I've gotten so engrossed on the importance of the ad-supported internet and trying to recognize, being that kind of pragmatist in this conversation of we need to give a little to get a little. And I'm always afraid that when I speak on this stuff and I try to convey the importance of this and why we need to try to find that kind of middle of the road approach to this, because I don't think you can be a zealot on this conversation on one side or the other, right? But I am afraid that my attempts to get this across comes across hollow. So I am curious, what's the feedback? Do you think do people generally fall on the side of like, no, like this is bad, these third-party companies that I don't know about that are doing terrible things, I want this to stop, I need to still get my content? Or like, are people tend to be more moderating on this topic? I tend to hope that people are, but I don't know. I feel like I live in a bubble or vacuum on this stuff too much. So I would like to hear people's feedback on what they think on all this more.
Okay. So during this podcast, we landed up talking about the new potential federal privacy bill that's being considered and bandied about. We talked a little bit about the different types of privacy laws that do exist, everything from GLBA to COPPA to HIPAA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about the value and the lessons we can learn from state privacy laws, for example, governance. We talked about how the NAI actual code of conduct does talk about very few but very appropriate things that should not be used with people's data, everything from creditworthiness to background checks. We then spoke about the harm that a ad-supported internet could cause. And I pointed out the idea of and the impact on the data shield and the transfer of data from the US, from the EU to the US and vice versa. But we talked about what are some new potential models, everything from a group-based privacy structure, if you will, so that individuals aren't implicated as much as a general group. And you pointed that might very well be the direction we'll end up going. We talked about ownership of data in terms of should data publishers have a role and have control over the type of data that's coming out. And then we spoke about the big need around maybe some learnings around how the future looks like in terms of cookies. And we're going to come back to that conversation. Did I miss anything?
That was a good summary. Well done.
Okay. Obviously, nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical advice of any kind. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. For those of you who missed it, Matthew, where can they reach you?
They can reach me on LinkedIn, Matthew Nichols, or certainly my email, matthew@networkadvertising.org.
Perfect. And for those of you who like this podcast, please leave a comment and subscribe. You can find me on Darshan Talks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast. Regulatory Guy, Irregular Podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.